Breaking the COVID rules on socialising is one thing, and Boris Johnson seems to have done plenty of that. But breaking the rules on self-isolation when infected with COVID is quite another. And that's exactly what Johnson is accused of doing in March 2020. You remember on March the 3rd, Johnson was bragging about all the hands of coronavirus patients he'd been shaking on a hospital visit.
Well, Victoria, I can tell you that I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody, you'll be pleased to know.
2 weeks later, he came down with a bad cough. Staffers are then reported to have repeatedly asked the Prime Minister to self-isolate, but he refused, glibly dismissing their concerns. A source told The Times, he said he was strong like a bull and banged his chest. He was advised that he might have COVID, but he rejected it. He had a really bad cough, but he was walking around the office and holding meetings. Finally, on March the 27th, Johnson went into self-isolation. But even then, it seems he just couldn't follow the rules, with staff being reported to have entered his room to fix his computer. Only 10 days later, on April the 6th, Johnson would end up in intensive care, where he nearly died. The Times story chimes with what Dominic Cummings had to say in this interview with the BBC last October. Cummings suggested that 2 weeks after his contact with the coronavirus patients, that's a similar timescale to when the Times is saying he had a cough, Johnson insisted on visiting the Queen.
I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to see the Queen." And I said, "What on earth are you talking about? Of course you can't go and see the Queen." He said, "Well, that's what I do every Wednesday. Sod this. I'm going to go and see her." I said, "I really don't think you should do that. Look around this office." As we spoke, we were in the outer office just outside his study. It was basically empty, partly because people in that office were isolating at home with symptoms. So I said to him, "There's people in this office who are isolating. You might have coronavirus. I might have coronavirus. You can't go and see the Queen. What if you go and see her and then give the Queen coronavirus? Like, obviously you can't go."
So the possibility went through your head at that moment that the Prime Minister might pass coronavirus to the Queen?
Yes.
How did you persuade him not to do it?
I just said, if you go and you give her coronavirus and she dies, what are you going to... You can't do that. You can't risk that. That's completely insane. And he said, he basically just hadn't thought it through. And he said, "Yeah, holy shit, I can't go."
So if we take Cummings' word, luckily he persuaded Boris Johnson not to visit the 93-year-old Queen. But if we take what's said in the Times, his irresponsible behaviour could have quite possibly passed on coronavirus to a number of people in his office. Dahlia, the idea of staffers asking Boris Johnson to self-isolate and him actually refusing, I find that, quite upsetting, actually.
Obviously, this is incredibly shocking, but I do kind of wonder why these lockdown parties are the thing that has made Johnson fall. Why is this the line that now means we are able to really have a conversation about the way that this man has governed during a pandemic? Because he's shown this kind of contempt for the virus, this kind of contempt for the pandemic, this contempt for the expertise of medical and scientific experts, has been evident from start to finish, as we saw in him, on the 3rd of March, bragging about shaking the hands of coronavirus patients, all the way through to dropping the mask mandate over and over again, even though it makes no sense and goes against the scientific recommendations, walking around hospitals without a mask. And this has happened throughout. It didn't just happen at the beginning when you could say, oh, maybe we didn't know enough, although by the 3rd of March, I'm sorry, we knew enough about the nature of this virus to know that you shouldn't shake hands with people who have coronavirus and then go on and go about your daily activities, talk less of go and visit someone who's 93 years old. So this is where I'm, and perhaps this is something that, historians or whatever will try and figure out at some point, which is why is this the moment where we decided to recognize that throughout this entire pandemic, we were governed by a politician who had absolutely no sense of the gravity of what he was undertaking, of no sense of the gravity of the situation. And that's why we ended up with, despite being in, a so-called developed country, having a socialized healthcare system, having a considerable sized economy, we ended up with such a considerable death toll. But the second thing that I was thinking about was when he got sick. I remember all of these commentaries coming out from people who knew Boris Johnson and were talking about how him being sick and being hospitalized will humble him, because he's always had this attitude towards being sick or being vulnerable, that, he believes he's too strong, he's too sort of, he can't be touched by vulnerability, he can't be touched by sickness. And I remember at the time thinking, this reveals so much about Boris Johnson, the way Boris Johnson views the world, is he views the world as people who are strong and people who are, make it through, people who are worthy and people who are weak and vulnerable. And it's so interesting how he equates his own so-called strength to just his natural ability, his natural giftedness, and not to the immense material privilege that he has had. And it not only tells me a lot about how he thinks about himself, because let's not forget, when he was hospitalized, any other person other than the prime minister might have actually died if they had it as severely as he did. He would have had the highest level of care that would have been possible in this country because of his position of power. But also it tells me so much about how he views people who struggle, people who are marginalized, people who are vulnerable for whatever reason. It tells me that deep, deep, deep down, he thinks it's because they deserve it, because he doesn't deserve it. And you can see that in that comment about him saying, he believed he was strong like a bull and banged his chest, and therefore he felt like he was immune from consequences. So that's a really convoluted way of saying that, even though you can listen to that and think, God, this man is just so incredibly dumb, it also actually tells us so much about the way that he views the world, the way that he views people who need support, or who have been disenfranchised by the world. He views it as, well, you're just not as good as me. You're just not as strong as me. And that's why I and the people like me deserve to have power and protection and material wealth. And it's just, I will be glad to see the back of it, which, as we can probably tell, won't be that long before we do.
The strong like the bull thing is really interesting as well, because I think what it also shows is just a lack of empathy, because the people telling him to self-isolate, they weren't necessarily saying, oh, Boris Johnson, you need to rest. So he said, no, I'm strong like a bull, I can keep going. They're saying, you might give us this deadly disease, so please self-isolate. All he can think about is himself. No, I'm strong like a bull, I don't need to self-isolate. Well, maybe you need to self-isolate for the benefit of other people. Maybe you could try, for once in your life, think about the needs and fears of someone who isn't you. And he clearly failed that test, as he has done over and over again throughout, it seems, his whole life and his whole career and his whole premiership, which hopefully will be coming to an end very soon.